Hello, students. Again, let me say how sorry I am to have had to be away from you for a little while, and especially today, I feel even more optimistic that I can return to the classroom on Wednesday. But just so that I don't leave you entirely in the lurch, I wanted to say a few comments about Othello in general, what you've read so far, and kind of maybe help guide your reading as you complete the play. And then after this, after you watch this, you can take a short quiz that will have questions mainly from this video, but also from Acts 1 and 2 of the play. Normally, I would give a big spiel about, what is the big deal about Shakespeare. He seems like one of those figures who has to be overrated because way too good to be true, way too much hype, and I completely understand that response. But hopefully, at the very least, reading the play Othello, thinking about it, might help you at least appreciate him, even if you don't quite see what all the hype is about. But of course, reading Othello alone is not really adequate because one of the things that makes Shakespeare the colossus that he is that he wrote in all these different genres. So, tragedy, yes, but also comedy and history, and even the comedies themselves can take on sort of different flavors. So that's a big part of it. And there's great stories and there's lots of interesting themes and that sort of thing. But I will just say this: this is kind of a hobby horse of mine, and that is that I think it ultimately comes down to the language. If Shakespeare was not such an incredible poet, his poems would be about as often read as Ben Jonson or somebody like that. I doubt you've probably read any of his plays. I know I haven't. Um, a few years back, we experimented with giving students a modern English, which is ironic because Shakespeare is modern English. But anyway, you know what I mean, a contemporary English kind of equivalent of Shakespeare. And it was so bad. It was just not even worth the time, really. So I know the language is a struggle. I certainly have to rely on those notes just like you do, but it really is worth the struggle, I think. A brief word on historical context, just to kind of locate where we are, because honestly, at this point in the course, things get a little wonky. We're starting to study the New World, and so that's putting us like in the late 1400s, very early 1500s, but this play was written in the early 1600s. So around 1603, 1604, Shakespeare was at the height of his mastery. He'd already written 24 plays. He had recently written Hamlet. King Lear and Macbeth were sort of around the corner. And of course, that raises an interesting question in itself. Why this burst of tragedy at this particular time? Well, part of it may be personal. There was a loss of a child. But also, I think it might reflect the national mood at the time because good Queen Bess, Queen Elizabeth I, was clearly not much longer for the world, and there was no clear successor. And so there was just kind of a sense that when she was gone, there would be this sort of inevitable decline. So that sense is in the air as well. Okay, now this is a tragedy, as I've already intimated. And of course, we've read tragedies in humanities. We read two in Humanities 101, Oedipus the King and Antigone. And Shakespearean tragedies certainly do share common elements with Greek tragedy. Shakespearean tragedies also have a tragic hero. And in many ways, the profile of the tragic hero is much like that of the classical Greek tragedy. So the Shakespearean tragic hero is someone usually of social importance, not just an ordinary person. There has to be some kind of reversal of fortune that unfolds over the course of the play, and some kind of dramatic calamity ending either in death or total devastation. Um, Although in Shakespearean tragedy, the cause for the downfall is much more clearly human action rather than some sort of impersonal fate, as it sometimes is in Greek tragedy. Now, Greek tragedies, if you think back to the two that we read, which are, I think, fairly typical, they don't necessarily need a villain. Oedipus, the king, um, there's no villain there. Even Antigone, I would say that Creon is not the villain. Indeed, Creon might well be the tragic hero himself, in which case, even then, Antigone is not really the villain either. But Shakespeare likes his villains, and of course, in Othello, we have what is arguably the greatest villain, not just like tragic villain, but like the greatest villain of all time. All right. So I just want to point out some elements to be thinking about, elements of the play that you've already encountered that I want you to be thinking about, and then some things to be thinking about specifically as we move forward. Hopefully you've noticed the geographical setting of the play, the fact that it begins in Venice. There is a threat, an apparent threat anyway, from the Ottoman Empire, which was an Islamic empire. And that apparent threat takes our principal characters to Cyprus, where they remain for the duration of the play. So what you need to be thinking about is the symbolic import of these locations. What does it mean, symbolically speaking, to move from Venice to Cyprus? I mean, I think from humanities already, the symbolic valences of Venice ought to be fairly clear. Around the time, certainly of Shakespeare's birth anyway, Venice was sort of the epicenter of the visual arts and the musical arts in Western Europe, period, a place of incredible civilization. And in a way, we see a kind of illustration of that early in the play with the trial that occurs, right? Brabantio is angry at Othello for eloping with Desdemona. And what could have just sort of been a private vendetta on Brabantio's part becomes a matter of public concern. And what you have is a bona fide trial. The Duke, who's kind of presiding over the trial, he demands evidence. So Brabantio's mere allegations are not going to be sufficient. Othello himself is allowed to testify in his own behalf. He's allowed to call his own witness. Now, remember these things because there's an irony in this, that Othello is going to be afforded these privileges, but later will not extend those privileges to another. So the way the whole trial occurs, and indeed, the fact that there's a trial at all rather than just a lynch mob, there's a trial, and the trial vindicates Othello because it finds Brabantio's accusations baseless. That suggests that Venice is a place of reason, a place of law and order, a place indeed of civilization. Okay? Now, Cyprus. Cyprus is located sort of midway between Venice and the Ottoman Empire. Now, of course, the Ottomans had a civilization of their own, no question. But in the eyes of sort of European Christians, Islamic culture meant barbarism. Okay, so in the European imagination of the time, the Ottoman Empire was a place not of reason, of law and order, but a place of barbarism, a place of um, authoritarianism, and so on. And of course, a place of infidelity, a place where Christianity was not freely practiced. So it's interesting that Cyprus becomes the main setting for the play as a kind of midway point between those two sort of symbolic poles of Venice and the Ottoman Empire. And Othello himself, as a character, is also a kind of midway character, because as I'll explain in a moment, his ethnic heritage was such that either he himself, we know he was a Christian, but either he himself was a convert from Islam to Christianity, or his parents or grandparents or something like that. Okay, so not Christian, but not in the same sense as these white Venetian characters are. So he's also kind of a character in between in some ways. So be thinking about what Shakespeare is up to. I know the introduction helps with this, so make sure if you haven't read the introduction in our edition to read that. What Shakespeare is up to by moving the action of the play to Cyprus, a place that is not entirely barbarous, but a place where several veneers of civilization get stripped away. All right, so the characters. Obviously, I don't need to tell you to pay attention to Iago, because he inserts himself in your face pretty effectively, I would say. In many ways, he's the central figure of the play. He has something like 200 more lines than Othello himself. He gets almost all those dramatic soliloquies. So in a way, the play could be named Iago, and you could argue that would be just as fitting, or perhaps even more fitting. Now, the thing about Iago is that ironies just kind of pile on irony. So he is the most duplicitous character in the whole play. But the irony is that he kind of lets us know from the very beginning that very fact, right? So there's never some big reveal. There's a Hollywood movie, right? Iago, would appear to us to be this upstanding, loyal friend, and then at the 11th hour revealed to be this conniving fraud. But that's not what happens in this play. Consider in Act 1, Scene 1, Iago says, "I am not what I am," which is like, his should be on his family crest or something, right? I am not what I am. Of course, also think for a moment about what that's negating. Take out the word not, and anyway, think about that. We'll come back to that on Wednesday. He also, in Act 1, Scene 2, swears by the god of Janus. And if you know anything about Janus, Janus is the god of doors, and he's the two-faced god. Okay, so again, Shakespeare is letting us know with no hesitation that this character is a liar and duplicitous and all the rest. We also learn that he's a character who is incredibly crude in a number of ways. The language that he uses, whenever you're trying, especially in Shakespeare, to kind of tease out a character, to figure out, what a character really stands for. Look at the first word, the first line that the character speaks in the play. And with Iago, his very first word is splud. Now that sounds strange to us, but that was a very strong profanity in Shakespeare's time. It's like by Christ's blood or something like that, but not in a pious sense, but in the sense that somebody would say, like Jesus Christ, that kind of statement. Okay, so literally the first word out of his mouth is he's swearing by sort of taking the Lord's blood in vain. Okay, it doesn't get much worse than that. He also evinces throughout even what we've read so far this really disturbing and disconcerting tendency to sexualize everything. I mean, he's like a seventh grade boy, right? Always trying to make everything sexual. So there's that exchange with Emilia, his wife, and Desdemona, where he says, "Women rise to play and go to bed to work." There's also that conversation he has with Cassio, where Cassio is making these very kind of gallant and noble compliments of Desdemona. I mean, it's clear that Cassio is in love with Desdemona, but it also would seem that it's not just a matter of lust either. But immediately Iago wants to reduce all of his sort of polite compliments into, just break them down into sheer lust. He also says to Cassio, in reference to Othello and Desdemona, he says, "Happiness to their sheets," right? So it's like what is wrong with this guy? Why does he have to make everything about sex? And I think actually there's a good reason about that, a good reason for that. And that is Iago is a reductionist. He thinks that in the world there appear these sort of noble sentiments and virtuous people, but when you strip everything away, all you're left with is a sheer kind of will for power. And so by reducing everything to like these very primal sexual urges, Iago is sort of saying, see, this is just all about conquest. Everything is about power. That's all there is. Now, one thing, of course, that has to be said about Iago, and this is, as we'll see, not entirely to his credit, is that he's incredibly intelligent. He's incredibly shrewd. And I mean, let's consider the fact that he basically fools everybody in the play until the very end. Now, the reason I say that this is not entirely to his credit, in fact, is quite to the contrary. Think back to Dante's hierarchy of sins. The worst category of sin of all is fraud. And remember, in the very last or second to last canto, the very last kind of level of Cocytus, the lowest place in hell, is the place for those who have betrayed their masters, which is, of course, precisely what Iago has done. But remember, what is it that's so bad about sins of fraud? Well, there's sins that involve the whole person, not just passions and appetites, but sins that corrupt the intellect. And the more that the intellect is involved in the sin, the more heinous the sin is. So I'll leave you to connect the dots as to what that says about the condition of our friend Iago. Now, one more word about Iago before I move on. One of the big questions, I think, and this has been the big question for hundreds of years in the interpretation of this play, is what to make of Iago's motives. It's entirely clear what he is. What's not so clear is why he is the way that he is. Now, of course, in a way, in some of those soliloquies that you've already read, he offers us some answers as to the why. But you might want to go back and look at those soliloquies, and you might want to ask yourself, do the reasons he gives to us, do they really quite add up? Indeed, are we really getting the real Iago in these soliloquies, or perhaps something else? So we'll come back to that. Think about that. Of course, I don't want to suggest, by spending so much time on Iago, that Othello was somehow a secondary or an uninteresting character. Quite the contrary. But I do want to say something about his sort of ethnic identity, because it is thematized in the play, and I think is important for the interpretation of the play. He is referred to repeatedly as a Moor, M-O-O-R. And of course, that in itself is rather degrading, right? For someone to be just referred to by their ethnic identity. I mean, I think most of us would be pretty shocked today, rightly so, if somebody referred to, their Jewish friend as the Jew, right? But characters do this left and right in Othello. So what is a Moor? A Moor is a North African with like kind of a mixed Arab and Berber descent. The Berbers were the people there in North Africa before the Arab invasion. Now, compared to the skin color of sub-Saharan Africans, Moors would actually have a fairly light skin color. But of course, compared to an Italian, it was darker. And so in the minds of, Europeans, white Europeans, Moors were black, right? They literally made sort of a black and white issue out of something that really wasn't black and white at all. So that is his background. That's his sort of ethnic background. And already in what you've read, you've seen racial prejudice at work in a number of ways. I've already mentioned simply the epithet the Moor. But we also see Iago, again, right out of the gate, Act 1, Scene 1, using Iago's ethnicity to inflame the anger of Brabantio, Desdemona's father, right? And I'll quote, "An old black ram is tupping your white ewe." Okay, see, already he's sexualizing everything. But notice he's also making things a black and white issue. And he's also comparing Iago to an animal, right? Or at least sort of comparing, interracial relations to like bestiality. Okay, so that's pretty clear. And you know what? His strategy is effective with Brabantio. Brabantio, I mean, I'm sure Brabantio would have been agitated by his daughter eloping with anybody, but it's very clear that more than anything else, Othello's blackness really gets under the skin, so to speak, of Brabantio. And remember, Brabantio and Othello are like buddies, but he turns on him in an instant and says, well, for a relationship this unnatural, the only explanation is some kind of witchcraft, right? So he accuses Othello of that. He cannot believe that Desdemona would go against, quote, all rules of nature. Okay. And even at the end of the trial, when the Duke is trying to kind of buck Brabantio up and sort of make him feel better about the fact that his daughter has married Othello, even the Duke's sort of defense of Othello is racist. The Duke says, your son-in-law is far more fair than black, which is a backhanded compliment if there's ever been one. So I think I mean, Shakespeare is in a number of ways telling us that his racial identity is significant. Now, what we're going to make of that significance, like how significant, that's going to be an issue for interpretation. Finally, just in terms of who he is as a character, because he's a character. He's not just you know, a symbol of blackness or something. What do we know about him? Well, we know that he is a very brave soldier, very experienced in the arts of war, but we also know by his own admission that he is quite inexperienced in domestic matters. Little of this great world can I speak, more than pertains to feats of broils and battles. In other words, put me on the battlefield and I know exactly what's going on. Take me off the battlefield and I am a lost little boy. And we're, of course, going to find out that this lack of kind of emotional intelligence and experience is going to come back to haunt him in a big way. This is going kind of long, so let me just go ahead, and there are obviously other significant characters that we'll talk about on Wednesday. But here's some things to be looking for and thinking about as you complete the play. 3 themes, okay? And none of these are, all 3 are pretty obvious, I think. The first, of course, is jealousy, right? This is in many ways a play about jealousy. Now, so far in your reading, you've got 2 jealous characters. You've got Iago, you've got Rodrigo. At this point, Othello is not a jealous person as far as we know, but of course that's going to change. So what is the play trying to say here? What about sort of where jealousy comes from? What makes us susceptible to it? What does it do to a person? Those questions. Secondly, be looking for all the places in this play, all the many places in this play, where there is a contrast between appearances and reality. I mean, the play is just so thick with irony, right? Irony, saying one thing, meaning another, whether that's intentionally or not intentional. So think about Iago for a moment. There's an epithet that's almost always used before his name by the other characters, and it is honest Iago. Of course, that is highly ironic. Iago himself, in one scene, accuses women of appearing to be something other than they really are, so that in public they sort of present themselves as demure and submissive, but they're quite the opposite in private. So he's sort of accusing women of this ironic behavior, and then of course there is another layer of irony on top of that, because it is the character Iago who does almost nothing unironically. There's an irony in that kind of character accusing another character or another set of people of being ironic. Brabantio, to come back to Brabantio, he claims basically the same thing with respect to Desdemona, that she fooled him with her appearances of virtue and fidelity to her father, and so he completely he says those were just appearances, I guess. That wasn't the reality at all. But again, notice what happens at the end of this trial. His charges are dismissed, and the Duke admonishes him for having no proof, but only poor likelihoods and seeming. In other words, Brabantio, all you have are appearances. You haven't really understood the reality here. Finally, sin and evil. I mean, this play is, among many other things, a meditation on the nature of evil. Obviously, Iago is the most crucial character here, but of course, Othello is going to be important as well. Unlike Iago, who just is evil from the very beginning, we actually watch Othello, who's a much more dynamic character, become evil. How does that happen? how does evil take root in the heart of a good person? Or should that make us question whether the character was truly good to begin with? If you've ever seen the show Breaking Bad, then you have you have a good reference point to think about some of these things. So I really look forward to discussing these things with you. Again, I'll let you know, but very optimistic that we can meet together in person on Wednesday. Thanks for your time.